All right, so here's our introduction to ecology. Really like what you have here, this picture of this owl, and if you can see closely, this little mouse who's about to become prey, and you can imagine he's nibbling on the moss on that tree. There's a whole lot of interactions here. The moss is growing on that tree, which doesn't really affect the tree, but the mouse is eating the moss, which it's going to use for food, but then that mouse is going to get eaten by that that big owl swooping down there, and that owl might take that food home to another tree that the owl has a nest in, which doesn't really affect it. So you can see all these interactions between the plants and animals and their environment. That's what ecology is, really. Ecology is a scientific study of interactions among organisms, between organisms and the environment or their surroundings. So it's animal to, or like plant to plant, animal to animal, and then animal to environment or plant to environment. Very complex. So if you look at this word right here, biosphere, bio meaning life, sphere meaning round, the biosphere basically includes anywhere there's life on our planet. So it can be the land, the water, the air. There's a caveat there. The biosphere extends about 8 kilometers above the Earth's surface and about 11 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. So anywhere life can exist is what we consider part of the biosphere. That's a test question right there. So what are the different levels of that ecology is studying? Well, if you look at this right here, you can look at the individual. That's an elk, not a moose, not a deer. That's a big elk down there in the bottom left-hand corner. That's an individual. And then you can look at a population of elk, like a herd, and all the, the elk population in Kansas, the elk population in Saskatchewan, or in an area. It's like this is going to be the population is going to be different from the white-tailed deer in Colorado is a different population than the white-tailed deer in Kansas because they're not interbreeding. The community includes all the different little populations: a population of moose, a population of lynx, a population of snow hare, a population of owl, a population of woodchucks. That's that little critter that's down by the bottom of the tree. Those are the communities. They're basically the groups of populations, which, population is a group of individuals. You see in the trend here? The ecosystem is a little different because it now includes the non-living portions. It's all the communities of all the different animals, moose, lynx, bobcat, whatever, and how they're interacting with the ground and the water and the trees and the air, or the non-living portions. That's the ecosystem. And wherever that ecosystem stretches, like an ecosystem might be a forest. Well, as far as that forest stretches, it's called the biome. Biomes are things like deserts, rainforests, prairies, tundras, all those things. And if you were to add up all the biomes on our planet, you'd have, that's right, the biosphere. So that's kind of the breakdown of how ecology is studied. So let's talk about, we had that individual, let's talk about a species. Now, this is a very, very important definition here. This is another test question. A species is a group of organisms so similar to one another, they can breed and produce fertile offspring. Okay? There's a lot of little pieces to that. Just because two animals can breed, and not to get too gross here, but technically, if you wanted to, just about any animal could have sex with another animal. But they have to be able to breed, get pregnant, produce babies, and those babies have to be able to produce babies. That's what the word fertile means. It means able to bear children. So just because you can have sex with something doesn't mean you're the same species. Just because you get pregnant, well, that means you're very closely related. And just because you can produce offspring does not make it the same species. Let me see what this next slide is. So, a classic example of this is this liger here. A liger is a combination of a male lion and a female tigress, and they produce this liger. And it's a real thing. Ligers are real critters. The problem is they are sterile, which is the opposite of fertile. They cannot produce babies. Now, some evidence has shown otherwise recently, but for the most part, they are not able, you can't take a liger and make a baby liger. It doesn't work that way. A more definitive example would be like a horse and a donkey. If you breed a horse and a donkey, they make a mule, but a mule cannot produce another mule. That's an example of two things that are not the same species. So it kind of makes sense. If you could technically get a lion and tiger to make a baby, well, that was fertile, then lions and tigers are the exact same species. That doesn't make sense. They're just close related. Species is really close related, that they can produce fertile offspring. So that's a test question as well. We talked about the populations in that one picture back here. Populations. Sorry, I should have left it a little longer. Populations is. Where's my mouse? Right there. And our definition there is all the individuals that live in the same area. A community is all the populations. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly because if you want to pause this and kind of think about what this is, you can. I don't need to read these to you. As I mentioned, the ecosystem is the first one that brings in the non-living physical environment. The biome is all those. We're going to do a big project on these biomes, all the deserts and tundras and rainforests, and prairies and savannas and all that jazz. So here's an easy question: where does the energy for all life processes come from? Where do you think is the main source of energy on our planet? So pause and talk to someone, or think about that, and give an answer out loud to yourself. Okay, so pause. Come back here. If you guess the sun, you are right. Okay, so anything that can basically use up this or take the sun and produce energy from it is called a producer. So the sun is the main source for energy on our planet. So it all begins with the sun, and then you have producers. Basically, you might be thinking of plants in this case. And you're right. There are other things that produce energy. For the most part, if you get hungry, you have to go out and consume food from somewhere else. Producers can literally sit in the sun and produce their own food. So I'm not talking about making your own food, like, oh, I make my own food, I put the Hot Pocket in the microwave. No. This would be like you could just go, you would be hungry, you go sit in the sun, and you'd no longer be hungry. That's what a producer is. And in most cases, it's the sun providing the energy for a producer. There are a few ecosystems that can get it without sunlight, and they basically just absorb inorganic compounds around them. These are places like, let's see what they get there. They don't really talk about. These are like really crazy organisms, like at the very bottom of the ocean, where there is no sunlight. So other than plants, you have algae and certain bacteria that can basically use the sun, and they are called autotrophs. Mr. Archibald, what's the difference between a producer and an autotroph? Nothing. Auto means self, troph means feed. They are self-feeders. They are producers. Autotroph, producer, same thing. They basically can just use inorganic compounds and the sun, and not always the sun. They basically can use energy from the environment to fuel and make these inorganic compounds. And they basically make their tissue that way. These organic, yeah, and I think that's good there. So I know I'm going really fast, but you have the ability to pause here. So because they make their own food, autotrophs are called producers. I already said that. Energy from the sun. The best known autotrophs are using solar energy. They're solar powered. So I don't know what the exact number is, but I would be willing to guess 90 to 95% of all autotrophs are solar powered. And how do they get energy? Through this process called photosynthesis. So you basically take up CO2 from the air and water, and they turn it into oxygen and carbohydrates. And we talked about carbohydrates. They basically can make their own carbohydrates. They produce energy molecules. And they also, as a byproduct, produce oxygen, which is really good for us because we need that to live. So I think this next one's a picture. This is photosynthesis. Right here, hope this mouse is showing, we have carbon dioxide, which chemically is CO2, and water. You catalyze this reaction with light in the form of solar energy. They produce carbs, and in this case, most plants use some of those carbs for energy. For the most part, though, they are built out of carbs. If you remember talking about cellulose is an indigestible carbohydrate. It basically builds plant structure. Since we use protein to build structure, plants use carbohydrates for structure. So whenever you eat a big piece of lettuce, broccoli, or anything that has any vegetable that has a crunch to it, that structure you're biting into is not protein. It's actually carbohydrates in the case of plants. And that carbohydrate is usually cellulose, which is indigestible to us. And they also produce oxygen, which is, we need that to breathe. If you look at this equation backwards, think about it, we breathe in oxygen, we eat carbohydrates, we give off water, and we breathe out CO2. We have a very good symbiotic relationship with plants where they produce what we need and we produce what they need. So in your notes, I want you to write this equation out. I want you to write CO2 plus H2O, that arrow going to the right. Carbohydrates, I'm going to tell you how to write that out. Most carbohydrates, the most common one they're talking about is glucose. And if you remember what that is, it's that little 6-carbon sugar. So you're going to have your arrow here pointing to the right, and you're going to have C6H12O6. C6H12O6, that's glucose, plus oxygen, but it's going to be O2. And then I want you to try to balance that equation. So one more time, it's CO2 plus H2O yields C6H12O6 plus O2. So pause this for a second and try to balance that. Okay, if you were successful, you should have 6 CO2s, 6 H2Os, 1 C6H12O6, and 6 O2s. That should be a balanced equation for photosynthesis. That's very, very important because this equation, the chlorophyll that allows photosynthesis in plants, literally is where 90% of our life on our planet comes from. These producers use photosynthesis and the sun it's basically the building block of all food chains and all food webs on our planet, for the most part, especially ones on land. So this is what that photosynthesis we were discussing right there, that's what it is. This is a nice visual, but you also on a test need to be able to draw that equation out and balance it. So plants, as I just said, are the main autotrophs on land. Algae are the main autotrophs in water. Blue-green algae that float around in the ocean and like the vast, wide-open Pacific Ocean, they make about 40% of the oxygen available on the planet. Now, that doesn't mean you should go off and chop down a bunch of trees, but that open water is just a breeding ground for photosynthesis, especially with photosynthetic bacteria. Let's see here, what else we have. Now, I talked about some of these autotrophs or producers that don't need light. They do a process called chemosynthesis, which is very, very different from photosynthesis, mainly because there's no light involved. And they're going to basically make the same carbohydrates, but from a really archaic process. Archaic means old school, and it usually means less efficient. Photosynthesis is crazy efficient. Chemosynthesis is not. This is a deep sea vent down at the very bottom of the ocean, no sunlight, extreme pressure, extreme heat by these vents, extreme cold for the rest of the part. This is just not a very efficient way to make a living. Chemosynthetic bacteria are just really kind of like peasants in this whole game. They take inorganic molecules like hydrogen sulfide, which is it's the smell of rotten eggs, and what little oxygen is around them, and they form sulfur compounds and basically make a little tiny bit of chemical energy. They also combine the seawater around them. It's a very strange process, and it's very foreign to us. When we first discovered these, we were going down to the bottom of the ocean like, wow, look at this. There's no light. There's extreme pressure. It's very cold. Then you combine it all of a sudden with extreme heat on these deep vents. How could anything live here? And lo and behold, look around. There's these really primitive, very old, ancient type of organisms just thriving down here. So it's like, wow, who'd have thought, right? It's only formed by a couple of bacteria. Matter of fact, when we try to take those bacteria up to the surface, a lot of them die because they can't be in the presence of oxygen. It kills them. So that's the chemosynthetic bacteria. You sometimes can see them in hot springs, like in Yosemite National Park as well. So that's where those little guys hang out. Oh, look at this. I forgot about this. You can find some in the tidal coast marsh, or the tidal marshes along the coast. So for the most part, you're not going to have much interaction with these bacteria. Most of your producers are plants. Let's contrast that with consumers. This is the stuff that eats those bacteria or eats those plants. We are consumers. We can't just go out and be chemosynthetic or photosynthetic. So we have to eat those guys that produce the energy for us. That's what makes us consumers. And just like producers are autotrophs, consumers are heterotrophs, meaning this hetero right here means other or different. We have to get our food from somewhere else, from somewhere other than ourselves. So we basically, it's not very fair. These plants do all this work to make all this energy and store it, and we come along and eat them up. So that's what consumers are. So I'm going to pause the video right here. That's kind of the first part of the notes. I'm going to try to keep that under 15 minutes. So we'll jump right back into consumers. But if you need to take a break for a minute and go use the restroom or get a snack, you can go ahead and do that.